ladies, gentlemen, boys, girls, horses, and all other things with hooves. This is Gaming Mechanics, a podcast that seeks to explore the unexplored topics in gaming, how they work, and why we love them. I, as always, am Anonymous Ferret. And by always, I mean this week I am Anonymous Ferret. Otherwise, AKA'd as Greg. And with me, as ever, is my illustrious co-host, Mark.
Hello, everyone, and I apologize for Greg's mistreatment of all other animals.
It's one of my favorite intros from Day 9. Sean Palat. All things with hooves. Anyway, this is our second take, actually. Unfortunately, we lost half of the audio, so there exists a half cast of myself doing everything, which would be really weird to listen to. But Audacity decided to be evil and crapped out on Mark's. So this is a take number 2. Also, a side note that I was gone last week, and we did not cast because I had the flu, and I didn't die, so that was great, because that actually happened. And
dying? That happened? You died once?
Yeah, no, yes, I did die. No, people have been dying from the flu.
Oh, yeah.
About that, but
I didn't.
A particularly bad year.
Yeah, sorry, that's a bad joke.
It was really nasty, but I did not. I made it. So yes, good. I'll be coughing a little bit. I have asthma.
Circumstances have conspired against us, but we are getting this episode out a little bit late.
Yes.
But we're going to get it out.
Yeah, it's going to friggin' happen. So today we are continuing our theme of 2D to 3D. And last week we did a kind of natural starting point in terms of racers and platformers, and the way that basically adding another dimension really changed the way that you were going to be thinking about motion and the way that you were going to be controlling a character in space, and how that's basically what platforming is. And so the next step in that was going to be combat, basically. So now that you can actually move yourself in three-dimensional space, now how do you interact with other things?
Right.
It seemed like the most pure example of combat, basically, when a game where if a platformer is just moving around and trying to jump things, then a game where you're just fighting things seemed to be the fighting genre.
Right. And we'll bridge that together with adventure games, which are moving and fighting things combined together at the end of the episode. Right. So we'll tie this into the last episode toward the end. So.
Correctamundo. So, but yeah, we are going to look at the 2D to 3D transition for fighting games, which is very interesting because I just spoiler alert, the only big huge scenes of fighting games I've gotten into are living with a semi-professional Melee player, so I know Smash decently, and then I got super into the NRS scene, which is the guys that do Mortal Kombat and Injustice, and have followed that really closely, and I played a lot of those games and enjoy them a ton. So I know those are kind of lightweight when it comes to all you Street Fighter fans out there, but all the same, I at least have a little bit of clout. That being said, I did not know too much about the history of fighting games, which was quite fascinating, particularly in terms of the change from 2D to 3D. So, Mark, would you like to take your historian hat, put it firmly on your head, and educate us?
Yes, I would be happy to. So I was sort of surprised to find out that early fighting games came out of boxing simulators. We've talked about how simulators are sort of a good starting point when you're doing something new with a new technology, because while you're trying to figure out the technology, at least the thing you're simulating is very well defined. And so, assuming you're not simulating like quantum physics. So,
yeah, right.
Boxing.
What was the one time example where like your metaphor was like?
Oh yeah, reverse engineering a computer.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. If you want to hear an example that doesn't really work because it's more complicated than the thing it's describing, check out my episode.
Yeah.
Check out my episode on Factorio. But
that was it. Oh man, that was brilliant.
Anyway, so Boxing Simulator is very simple, right? Because the rules of boxing are very well defined. I know there's a lot of nuance to boxing, but there's also a ton of rules, a lot of things you can't do, and you punch, and then you clinch and you reset, and it's pretty straightforward. So that was what the early fighting games were. They were just boxing simulators. And I believe as more Japanese influence came into the video game scene, and as the technology got better, you could do things other than just lateral movement. If you think about the way that we punch, you just extend your arm forward, right? Especially in a boxing context. And then there's uppercuts, which there's a little bit more of a flair to that. But it's pretty easy to animate. There's not anything too complicated happening. Moving into martial arts and MMA style fighting, there is a lot more going on. And so at first they couldn't support that level of technology. And then later on, you got games like Street Fighter 1 and these games lend themselves to being a bit more of a spectacle than early boxing games.
Right. Yeah, very much so. And you see that too, even just with kind of those early. I mean, one, you look at Street Fighter, and already it has this very, I don't know if fantasy is the right thing. It's all anime-y, maybe a little bit different, but basically everyone has superpowers, or is doing non-human things. And then if you look at Mortal Kombat, when it came out, that was basically all about spectacle. That game actually wasn't even that good technically. It did a few cool things in terms of the fact that it was had some like stop motion animation, so they actually had real actors that they got to do all these different things, and that was the way that they did that. But the big thing was just the brutalities, or not the brutalities, the fatalities. I don't think they had brutalities until 3 or 4. And these horribly gruesome just spectacles of death and dismemberment, which of course continued on. But it is interesting to think about the fact that, pretty immediately we went from fighting games as kind of simulating fighting games did not become the norm, in the same way that like racing tried to move probably more towards that,
right?
With like say the Forza series or so on and so forth, where the more realistic you got it, kind of the cooler it was. Not the case with boxing.
Yeah, I have to say like and a logical extension of the boxing simulator would be like an MMA simulator, and there aren't a lot of those. Like there always appears to be.
Exist.
Yeah, they exist, but I think the more popular really fighting games are more like they have more of a fanciful element to it. Like Injustice was huge, and even Street Fighter. You've got lots of things that are supernatural, I guess, happening in the fighting games.
Yes. You cannot Hadouken. That is not a.
I don't know, man. You meditate long enough, you can do a lot of weird stuff.
Yeah, aren't quite real. Anyway, so all this is to say, we have some Eastern influences coming in the historical record, particularly, and obviously all of this is 2D, right? When we talk about 2D, we'll define this. Again, we're talking about 2D gameplay mechanics, right? Where you're just only can be moving on 2 axes, up, down, left, right. And that is kind of the vast majority of fighters. Obviously, once 3D came, there's current games, MKX and Justice 2 and Street Fighter 5. All of those are rendered in 3D, but are still played in 2D. So for the purposes of this podcast, we'll call those 2D fighting games still.
Right.
Truly, 3D ones did not come out until the very first Virtua Fighter,
right,
which I had heard of, even with my low level of plebeian fighting game knowledge, and knew was one of the big 3D titles. And then we went back and began looking at how important it was, and kind of it blew my mind. Give the list of things that Virtua Fighter was responsible for. It basically functioned as this like industry-wide proof of concept that 3D was cool and could be done.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And in some, I kind of wish we would have mentioned it earlier in our overview, but it's a huge deal. Virtua Fighter was responsible for inspiring the creators of the PlayStation 1 to make it a 3D platform. Originally, it was going to be just a really souped up 2D rendering system, and they saw Virtua Fighter, and that was one of the things that convinced them that actually 3D was the way to go.
Yeah. So let that sink in for a second. The PlayStation 1, which is, arguably the most, again, arguably, but one of the most important consoles ever released, one of the most successful, really defined a new genre, or not genre, but a new age of gaming, basically happened because some people at Sony Computer Entertainment in Japan saw Virtua Fighter and were like, oh, wow, yeah, no, 3D is really cool. Like, we should do this.
Yeah, we should jump on this.
It sounds like I can't exaggerate that enough. It's like, oh yeah, the PlayStation's 3D because of Virtua Fighter. It's like, no, that's actually kind of what happened. What else? I mean, we got Quake, right? The developers of Quake said the same thing.
Yep, they were inspired by Virtua Fighter.
In case you don't know anything about shooters, literally every single first-person shooter can be traced back to Quake. Mm-hmm. And same thing with a very, very famous character who had very triangular boobs. Lara Croft, the whole entire Tomb Raider series was inspired by the fact that Virtua Fighter was possible.
Right,
And
and
if you go back
that
and look at
the
the very original Virtua Fighter, it is I mean real bare bones. It's one step above. It's basically barely textured wireframe, but it is fully 3-dimensional. It's not quite. Well, there's one more step that games made. Importantly, with the Dreamcast actually for 3D fighters, but at this point it was the first game where you could basically you were still moving. It was easiest to move left and right and up and down, but you had a depth. You had a Z-axis that you could actually move around. So basically, you could rotate the rails that you were on,
right.
as well as introducing. And if you got hit out of something, then you actually could fall, sideways or left or right,
Right.
which was a huge deal.
Yeah, there isn't a dedicated button to moving in the z-axis, but you could get knocked off axis, is what I'm going to call it. But where you're
Right.
typically in a fighting game, you're moving just on a two-axis system, you could get knocked sideways on that plane. And you'll notice that because although the characters automatically correct to face each other, the stage will rotate in the background.
Right.
And
And interestingly enough, so Virtua Fighter. Oh, sorry.
no, I was going to say that's almost the only way you would even notice is if you're looking closely at the stage. But it is a significant graphical difference.
Basically, correct. And now, so then the interesting thing too is right. So that the PlayStation launched and got to define 3D for everything. Virtua Fighter was obviously, I believe it was first. It was just a PC game, and then ported to. Or no, it was an arcade game. It was an arcade game first,
Yeah,
obviously,
it started
and
as an
then
arcade
eventually
game.
ported to PC. But so fascinatingly enough, then we have again, like I said, we kind of have the very clear 3D fighters, like we got Killer Instinct, the whole Soul Calibur thing, which we'll get into for a second. The whole Virtua Fighter series actually is still going, versus the two Ds, kind of like your Street Fighters, Marvel vs. Capcom, all of your the Mortal Kombat side of things. And then there is this little weird middle ground that came out of actually the PlayStation 1 with Tekken and another very famous fighting series, which I actually enjoy a lot. I got Tekken 5, I think, way back in the day. And that was the first fighting game I actually ever owned. But Tekken is similar in that it is like 2D, 3D, pseudo. It's not the full 3D experience, particularly as used in modern 3D games, fighting games. But it still does have that basically being able to dodge left and right aspect,
Mm-hmm.
and has transitionary stages, which is a little bit harder to do in 2D. You can still do it. I mean, Injustice does it, but it's a different. It's basically just an animation to take you to a new map, as opposed to actually like falling through the map literally.
Right.
So Tekken actually kind of fulfilled that little PlayStation niche of those guys who'd seen Virtua Fighter and were like, "Holy crap, we should do something like this," and thus the first Tekken was born.
Right. The Virtua Fighter, the original, never made it to the PlayStation, in spite of inspiring the PlayStation. But
Yeah,
Tekken
which
did, and that was the culmination of their dream to have a 3D fighter, and a number of other 3D games, obviously. But
yeah,
yeah, what Greg mentioned is that fighting games basically secede broadly from either the Street Fighter sort of genre or the Virtua Fighter genre. And then there's one more distinction that's going to come up with Soul Calibur.
right. Which was a huge deal in terms of, well, one, it's actually rated as the original Soul Calibur. So there is actually, before Soul Calibur, there was a game called Soul Edge, which was not nearly as successful. It was same thing, arcade based. I think it might have ported to the Sega Genesis at that point. And then Soul Calibur was the second one, and the same thing, started on arcade. But it was also a release title for the Dreamcast, the Sega Dreamcast, which has a very near dear place in my heart because that was my first console, first video game system I ever had. And we had it for, I think, a year and a half until the PS2 came out, and then we got a PS2 traded in.
And so did everyone
But
else.
I know, but I love that console. I still have two Dreamcasts. One doesn't work, but I bought a newly functioning one, and I still play it sometimes. I played it this past Christmas, actually. But anyway, point of all of this is that Soul Calibur released for it, and that game is not only considered one of the best fighting games of all time, it's actually on the list of top fighting, I believe, on Game Rankings. It's number 4, one of the best reviewed games ever released,
Wow.
which is obviously a pretty high praise. And Soul Calibur was unique in that it did get that first true 3D where it was a full 8-point directional system, where on your left hand was the joystick and the right hand was basically punches and kicks and body motion.
Mm-hmm.
and that you could literally just run in any direction within the ring. It also, I believe, I think Ring Out existed before Soul Calibur. I think that was
Yeah,
probably a
actually,
Virtua
Virtual
Fighter thing.
Fighter pioneered Ring
Yeah,
Out.
yeah, the whole
Um,
idea of Ring Out, which we'll get to in a sec. But
but
Soul Calibur is a huge deal, not only because of its gorgeousness and its extremely stylized gameplay, but it's also, which I think is very fascinating, was the first game to both take advantage of complete 3D motion as well as it being primarily weapons based, as opposed to like martial arts based, where every
right.
character had a weapon or set of weapons. And maybe that means nothing. I have a few ideas about why that might have been so successful with the first 3D, fully 3D fighting game
Mm-hmm.
was a weapons based game. Um, we can get into that in a little bit, but that was the next huge leap forward, I think, for fighting games. And
Yeah, and for those who don't fully appreciate the difference between for something like Virtua Fighter and something like Soul Calibur, it's kind of like the difference between like Crash and Mario 64. Whereas Crash is somewhat on rails, like you're still going mostly forward.
it's
You
not
can
bad.
go
Yeah,
left and right, like it is 3D, but you're basically going down a long hallway. Whereas Mario
right.
64, you're in a more or less open arena, and you can kind of jump around and do whatever you want.
Yeah, and explore the entirety of it. No, that's a good analogy, actually. I like that. So that was obviously a huge deal. Now, the really interesting thing is, well, let's go to a few different things. I think the fact that obviously, again, when we're talking about fighting games in general, particularly modern ones, fighting games are actually pretty niche.
Yeah.
They're popular, and obviously they're still being made, but they're not huge triple. It's basically they're really exciting for the communities of people that really love those games.
Right. Yeah, if we
Which
continue on the story of the history of fighting games, it turns
right, yeah,
out
yeah,
that actually the popularity wanes, and there's a few different ideas I've run into, theories about why that may have happened, and one of the more prominent ones is that fighting games became increasingly complex, and the complexity started to scare away new players.
yeah.
If you and it's
Which is, I
also
mean, yeah,
it's hard to go back on that complexity for the people who really like the games though. So
right. Who
if you
became the core audience?
right, like if you loved the fact that Soul Calibur had dozens of moves per character that you could memorize, and some of the button combinations were 5 or 6 buttons long, then like playing a game that's much simpler and more dumbed down, like Super Smash Brothers, is not going to really appeal to you. It's going to feel like a step backward, and
Yeah,
yet it's really
and
intimidating to the people who are new to the game.
very much so. I mean, just go pull up. I mean, again, like I've been watching the Injustice 2 scene a lot right now. Shout outs to the guys over at War of Gods. That's a fantastic show. It's every week. They're in season 2 right now, week number 7. Actually, top 8 is tonight that I'm missing to do this podcast. But anyway, go look at, and not only, fighting games are usually renowned too for their giant rosters. So it's not only you're learning one character, you are learning usually multiple characters. On top of the fact, like, so say in Justice, right, a single special move, which would just be something outside of a normal kind of punch or kick combo, is usually 3 inputs. So usually 2 directions and then an input button. Now string that, and that's a single move, right? And now most large combos are going to be some combination between 10 and 30 hits. You are looking at dozens and dozens of inputs for a single combo. And no, seriously, go watch like streams of guys that stream if they have their input up, and you'll watch it. It looks like the Matrix, like it scrolls up and it looks almost random. And every single one of those moves is precise. So they are extremely technical. And like I
Right.
said, even the NRS theme games, the Injustice and Mortal Kombat, are relatively actually less complex and nuanced than even say Street Fighter or Marvel vs. Capcom. So that being said, yeah, it definitely turned into an extremely complicated thing where it's actually kind of hard to pick up at all. And
Right.
I think the interesting thing is, even when we're talking about the games that still have scenes and really healthy scenes at that, I mean, a lot of money gets paid out, and people still do this professionally, and hundreds and thousands of people watch and tune in and stuff. Are only the 2D games survived, basically. There's still, like I said, the 3D games still get played at like Evo and Apex and stuff like that, but certainly not with anywhere near the scene as say Smash, say Street Fighter, NRS I kind of lumped together, and then Marvel vs. Capcom. So interesting that in the war of the 2D versus 3D, 3D did not win out. in fact, in terms of longevity.
Yeah, and I
Like I
have some
said, that's
theories about what that is. We might talk about that toward the end of the episode. But that's a
yep.
really interesting phenomenon because we saw how good 3D was for racing games, and nobody's playing 2D racing games anymore. Not seriously. Like maybe for retro or ironically, but nobody's like
Yeah, I
itching to
have
go play pole position.
no. Yeah, yeah. Right. The original GTA.
Yeah, right? So it's yeah, this transition again, our theme has sort of been it was good for some games, it wasn't so great for others, like as a
Right.
genre, not even
Yep.
just like for individual franchises.
Right.
Um,
Which is so interesting because again, the only fighting game that's anywhere close to this masterpiece, well, maybe not anywhere close, but that is considered just universally a masterpiece, is the one 3D fighting game, truly full 3D fighting game that did that, which is Soul Calibur. So it's just a very interesting kind of paradox there. The last thing I'll say about before we move on, but again with the fall, I think, or maybe not fall, but rather compressing of the fighting game genre was another huge part of it, as we mentioned before, was spectacle. And it was really a genre that took really, really well to the arcade era.
yeah,
That was a lot harder, I think, to transition. Because like I literally remember, I grew up in the '90s, and I remember going to arcades, like when my brother played indoor soccer or whatever at these big, huge convention places, and I would go to the arcade instead of watching me play because I was a nerd. And I literally remember like when that one kid who could beat an entire fighting game, it was Marvel vs. Capcom, would come in, and like people like literally would gather around and like watch him play it, and it was so cool because you'd see parts of the game you'd never. Uh, and it was a very, very social thing. And same, like I said, combat was developed in large part just for spectacle's sake, to have secrets and to have these weird, kind of cool, uh, absolutely terrifying things that kids weren't supposed to see.
yeah.
That just, I think that became a lot harder to do.
Think about like Mortal Kombat with their fatality system. I mean, those were hard to figure out. Like you didn't just know those
Yeah,
right
they're
off the
secrets.
bat.
There's
They
nothing
were
in the game.
essentially, yeah, they're secrets. And so it was so cool to watch somebody pull one of these things off. Or there was just so many fun things to watch in early fighting games that I think made them more popular.
Yeah,
And then
yeah,
once video gaming moved away from arcades, I think fighting games took a hit in general. So some of that just sort of coincided with 3D, but I also think there was that increasing specialization and complexity that happened.
yeah, absolutely. And there's some level of we saw the kind of the cross branding with Marvel vs. Capcom. Mortal Kombat tried to do that with DC, trying to usually basically kind of grab some uh, more, I don't know, mainstream characters as opposed to kind of the very Eastern Japanese bizarre ones.
Mm-hmm.
But in large part, like I said, it's really interesting to me that we basically got to the point where 2D games pretty much won out. So let's talk about real quick, Mark. Just some of the differences, right? We've talked about kind of the history, but physically or uh, mechanically, what happened in the jump to 3D, particularly as it goes to like block. I
Yeah.
think was an interesting discussion we had.
Well, so if you think about how blocking works in fighting games, if you just unilaterally blocked the direction you were facing, which might be a kind of an obvious way to do blocking, then you're blocking way too much of your attack surface, right? So you're vulnerable on two sides. If you're blocking a full side in 2D, you're blocking 50% of your available attack surface, right? So that's blocking is way overpowered in that case. So they decided to break blocking down so that you've got low, medium, high, and sometimes an overhead blocking. And so now you can only block a sixth or maybe an eighth of your attack surface. And so that balances out blocking because a game where there's too much blocking, it's just really slow and pokey and it's not fun to watch. And we want fighting games to be a spectacle, especially early on.
Right.
And so when you move to 3D, you have actually a lot more than two sides. You have an infinite number of sides rotationally. And
Right.
if you include below and above, then forget about it. It's blocking takes a real hit, it would seem, because if you can just sidestep and attack somebody out of their block, then like why would you even bother blocking? Like the best
Right.
defense would become a good offense at that point. And so to balance things out. they went ahead and made it so that you can block usually maybe between a 90 and 120 degree angle from the direction that you're facing. They stuck with the high, medium, and low system. But if you do the math, you're actually still blocking a smaller part of your total available attack surface than you were in 2D. And so it should,
which I think is
it
really
should,
interesting.
yeah, it should lead to 3D fighting games being more aggressive. But you brought up a good point in response to that, Greg.
Well, it's interesting that one other side effect of so suddenly we have this system where angles, the ability to block everything is completely impossible. So we kind of got a way around that by putting out a cone basically that you'd be blocking in. But then the other interesting thing is you'd still think, like you said, as a percentage, that's still a massively lower percentage than what of all the possible attacks that you could have to take. Mm-hmm. Then again, back to the 2D situation where you kind of have the high, mid, overhead, low. And then cross-up scenario. And but the difference is, if you think about it, especially with games with teleports in them, 2D, basically in a 2D game, you can, from neutral, where you're just standing, the two characters are standing right next to each other, basically there's some level of guesswork where you can immediately attack low, mid, high, or almost every character will have a move that can do that just off the bat, and you don't know which one's going to be, so that's part of the game. Or, like I said, a teleport crossing up, going to the other side, and suddenly you have to guess again. You can do that in neutral. In a three-dimensional space, though, you can't, if you're at neutral, you can't at any point attack from any angle, right? You actually have to, if you want to attack from completely behind the other character, you'd have to move all the way around to the back.
Right.
If you want to be attacking from above and, to the left, upper left side, then you have to go that way and then jump and come backward. You still have actually a very, basically, not only are there more attack options, or more angles, but it's harder for the attacker to get to those. So now instead of necessarily kind of some of the guesswork or the basically combo really long frame oriented combo strings that come out in 3D games, you have a game of a lot more about position and making sure that you get into these areas, and you even see that in terms of one of the win conditions being ringing out as opposed to just depleting a health point, which I think is a really cool thing too, in that you suddenly have a completely legitimate alternate win condition for a genre, which is like in racing. When we got 3D racing, there wasn't an extra you still had to be the first one to finish cross the finish line. It's not you could cross the finish line higher, and suddenly you got something more.
Right.
So it's interesting in that we literally gave a new end state to the genre with third dimension.
And it's interesting to think about why that evolved. Like in 2D, getting put in the corner it's not great. It's bad for you. It's hazardous to your health, and
right.
If you stay there too long, you'll likely lose. But even good players will get pushed up to the edge, and they just are good at being able to get out of that position. And that's just
right.
part of 2D fighting games.
Right.
I would contend that it's not part of 3D fighting games to get pushed up to the edge because you have so many more positioning options. And so if your opponent manages to either force you toward the edge or you just don't realize what's happening, then you deserve to be punished. And that punishment is actually an instant death in the form of a ring out in a lot of these games.
Yeah. Yeah, which is, I really liked when you thought that one up, the idea that basically if you are at the edge, it means you've been outplayed in a significant way.
Right.
That's kind of true in the 2D sense as well. Usually the person that managed to corner carry, but depending on the character, some characters have really good corner carry, which means that they can, if they open you up once, they can move you really far down the stage. Mm-hmm. And so some characters just are really good at that, and if you get opened up once, suddenly you're in the corner and you have to deal with that, and that's part of the character. They probably will have a little bit worse corner pressure for it.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't mean that you got completely just outplayed. It means the character's doing what they're supposed to do. Like you said, in a 3D situation where you have like Killer Instinct, Dead or Alive, Virtua Fighter, being up against the edge is quite literal in that case, and is like you said, probably a sign the fact that you actually are losing the match.
Right. Yeah. Pretty significantly.
So it's interesting too that I don't know. Again, we've been talking about. So outside of, I want to at least mention one other thing with ring outs, the fact that one glaring spot in this the ointment of our theory here about 2D, 3D is Smash, right? Being basically about ring out in a two-dimensional sense, right? It's the only two-dimensional ring out game I can think of, and obviously Smash is arguably one of the biggest fighting games right there.
Right. And it has a very different dynamic, though, and it's a style of play is much more, I guess, I would say punishing, right? I mean, you don't have the equivalent of meteor smashes in a game like Street Fighter.
Right.
And I think in
Well,
that way it's more fast paced, and it really just, it's not that you can't have ring outs in 2D, but it does significantly change the play style.
very much, and I think it's funny too that like when you think about the origins of Smash, it was supposed to be a party game, right? Like it was not designed, and even Melee, which is still kind of the gold standard of the Smash series, was not built as a competitive game at all.
No.
In fact, quite the opposite, and it had all these different little systems and glitches. And we talked about Melee a lot in terms of its meta and its development of its meta and the emergent gameplay things that came out of it. But I think it's interesting again to note that that is the only game that is that kind of unique, weird niche of the ring out design in 2D, and the fact that it came, no one tried to design that; it just kind of happened. So I feel like that's more an anomaly, like an accident, as opposed to be like, oh, what can we learn from this? I think there are things to learn from Smash, but I think there's a reason there's only one of them, in large part. And I think Nintendo did what they do and hit the secret sauce basically, and capitalized on it quite well.
Yeah.
And Melee is fun to watch too, man. I mean, it's a beautiful game. Seriously, it's hard to follow if you don't know what you're looking at, and the scene is so old that it's pretty difficult to get into. But like I said, I've watched a lot of Smash, and it's a I mean, really, honestly, outside of, in my opinion at least, I'm gonna get just incredible amount of hate for this. But the extreme, so like StarCraft Brood War and StarCraft 2, and then fighting games I think are some of the most impressive mechanical displays of video games that exist. The amount of skill, timing, and coordination that you need to do well at those games is truly staggering.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they're like up there with games like, this is more of a macro scale, but like Dance Dance Revolution is so much fun to watch people do. But that is,
Yeah.
that's more of like broad physical display as opposed to,
Right.
unless you can watch somebody's inputs really closely, it can be hard to even appreciate what all the work is they're putting into what's happening on screen.
Yeah, precisely. Very much so, and that's actually a decent. I like that transition to talk about. We've talked about this in the past couple episodes too, but we'll do this a little bit earlier than we did. Usually this would be at the end, but I think it's fine now. Talking about the fact that kind of the next big technological jump that would be semi comparable to 2D to 3D would be something in the realm of maybe VR, basically in terms of changing the way that you'd play games, or at least what was possible with games.
Right.
And so as we were talking and thinking about, how fighters could evolve past 3D into something more, it was a lot harder actually. We talked about last week with racing. Racing was like custom built for VR, right? Like it's very easy to actually simulate being in a car because it's actually that's just really easy to do. It's really simple. It's
right. Your control scheme is very well defined.
Right. Yeah, people do that. Like I drove a ton today. It was horrible.
It was just like VR, but in person.
You just cut out. What did you say?
I said it's just like VR, but in person.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. You cut out somehow. I just heard it's just like VR. And I was like, interesting.
Yeah, the joke was actually about that bad, so no worries.
Okay, so roughly equivalent. No, anyway, but with fighting games, the evolution is not quite as apparent because, again, as you get closer and closer to simulation, eventually you're just learning a martial art, like in VR. Right? Like you don't actually want realistic fighting. Like quite the opposite, actually. It's the reason.
Yeah.
Sorry,
in our discussion,
so we don't have to fight people.
Yeah, that's true. That's a very good point. When we were discussing how fighting games could move forward and how they could deal with this complexity gap that's opened up, it was complicated when fighting game designers added a lot of different moves for their characters. It was also fun, but it was intimidating. And then when we moved to 3D, things just get more complex. And so I think that my theory is that one of the reasons 3D fighting games have not been as popular is that they are even more complex, and it's even
too
more
complex,
niche.
actually.
And it's actually there's too much to account for with a fairly limited control scheme. And
Yeah.
so, like the
Let's go back
control
for a
scheme
second.
for fighting games haven't changed in pretty much since they came out.
Yeah, no, very much so. In fact, even the notation is basically identical when you get it. I mean, there's Eastern and Western notations, but um, yeah, I mean, it's the same notation that's been around the 80s. But let's go back for a second to illustrate this point, which I think is good, to talk about Soul Calibur and the fact that weapons were introduced, right? And why I thought that the potential was that weapons were the big, huge sell. Outside of them being really cool, and
Yeah.
having a game called Soul Calibur is just that's cool. It's the name of the sword that you're trying to get is the Soul Calibur. Um, is that the thing again? It goes back to Mark's point a little bit earlier when you're talking about in just like kinetically at least, the mechanics of throwing a punch or a kick are actually decently straightforward in terms of that it's coming out and particularly in 2D you can kind of animate outwards from your character and then it comes back and that's it. With weapons, you have a very different. Suddenly, it's not anywhere limited to, particularly with different types of weapons. It's not limited to a single physical motion. Now you can actually be doing these weird long overhead slashes. You can do overhead chops. You can do stabs and combinations of
Right.
literally anything, any motion in 3 dimensions,
Humans, like,
which
are
is,
the
like I said,
human.
completely impossible to do in 2D. Basically, a slash would be equivalent to a punch, right? It would just be moving outwards then coming back. But in 3D, you can suddenly actually render that fully, interact that way, and then when you move in the fact that your characters can move in a full z-axis as well, suddenly you have this entire new system that gets to spring up, and is really cool and really fun and really different. So I think that's my theory on why Soul Calibur was so cool and why particularly the first 3D fighting game that did so well was a weapons-based one, because it really actually tapped into what was new about 3D and why 3D was so much cooler and better in this case, as
Right.
exemplified by weapons.
Think about a moment where, like, you're in a 3D scenario, you think of your opponent's coming in with an overhead slash, and so you step further into the screen on the z-axis to try to avoid the attack, and instead it's a horizontal arc with the sword and you get clipped anyway. Like, that
Right.
whole exchange could not happen in 2D.
Can't even Yeah, you can't even comprehend that in 2D.
Right. And so, like, it's that sort of play and counterplay which is opened up in a 3D environment. And I like what you said that, like, humans, if you're just simulating a human body, we attack in front of us, right? I mean, you're not going to be able to defending against somebody with your back to them for very long. It's
Yeah.
not a good way to fight somebody. I don't recommend it. And so
The
you,
reason there's no martial art based around the back defense.
but
There probably
you,
is. I'm going to eat my words, but
yeah, there's a lot of weird stuff out there. But for most normal humans, attacking forward and facing your opponent with lateral strikes, for the most part, blows that are perpendicular to your frame, are going to be generally
right,
how you fight. Um,
right,
Whereas with weapons, because the lethality increases, you don't have to get every single bit of force behind a sword thrust. Because if you
right.
clip somebody on the neck with a sword, it still does a lot of damage.
Yeah. Suddenly, yeah. It's over. No, that's a great point. That's a good deconstruction of weapons and why they take a different fighting stance than martial arts. But anyway, bring that back to the whole VR scenario. Again, that added complexity that we're talking about that is actually very difficult to even conceptualize, much less begin to realize in terms of a system. As good as Soul Calibur was, it still wasn't. You couldn't. You had buttons you'd press, and then they would do something. You couldn't literally control exactly the angle and the motion and the speed and the acceleration of a fully 3-dimensional thing. And I think that basically is the problem we're running into. Is that, like I said, you have motion on the left hand and 4 buttons on the right hand, and then usually triggers, so another 4 inputs. But in large part, you basically have 4 inputs and directions. And that's actually not enough to really take advantage of the entirety of. I mean, it's the same reason that you don't have, like we said, like if you were going to do fighting in VR, you'd actually just have to actually learn a martial art, like how to actually move, because it's so much more complex. You can't condense that down into our current form of video gaming, which is the controller.
Yeah, so we've got this, like, dichotomy
So
where
it might be that, yeah,
it would be really
3D was
cool.
basically too complex, actually.
Yeah,
That's why it didn't win out.
but it would also be really cool, right? I mean, like, who doesn't want to be able to do that?
Oh,
But
totally.
the control scheme for it just seems like learning a martial art. Like, I can think of a control scheme for it, and it would just be, well, detect where your body is and have the game respond to your body positions. But
Right.
at that point, you're just learning to fight, like you said.
Basically. So, and that's this is actually a decent bridge too into the next kind of talking about like combat just in general and adventure games and stuff because this makes me think of Dark Souls specifically, and basically a game that is rendered that is very combat oriented lives and dies off its hitboxes, right? So where and how they interact. So the tighter and tighter the hitboxes to the weapon or the creature, and by hitbox I just mean literally what the game sees as like interacting. So if usually they're not literally a sword shape, it's a small box around the sword that will interact with another small box around a character, and when those two things interact, the game's like, hey, that got hit. That's what I mean by that. So the tighter and tighter you get with hurt boxes and hit boxes, the closer and closer to simulation you get, right, with reality. And
Right.
there's actually the whole kind of subgenre called hitbox porn, which is really beautiful examples of games being really, really precise. And that Dark Souls did that very, very well, particularly as the series went on. Was that it was a very, very precise game, a very slow and methodical game, and being able to, when you swing your sword, trust that, hey, if anything is in, knowing your sword swing well enough to know if there's anything that's going to get caught in that, or even looks like it's going to get caught in that because you're playing a game, you will count on it getting hit, or vice versa, as you're learning enemy attack patterns. Hey, I know the sword's going to come this way. I think if I can time my roll, then it looks like my character will actually kind of duck under it, even though it's still going to be in the way of the strike. Hopefully, if it's programmed well enough, you can actually do that. And like I said, the later Dark Souls did that very well, where you can. It's very, very precise, and there's very razor thin edges that can be missed or hit. So that's basically when you keep on condensing that down, you just get closer and closer to, like I said, the simulation part and the reality part. And I don't know if a VR Dark Souls would actually be that fun, because actually I could almost guarantee you it wouldn't.
It would certainly be
I'm trying to think about that actually. I mean, it would be horrifying. I don't know if you ever played those games, but they just exist in these horrible, horrible worlds that are designed to kill you. So, we talked about kind of with our horror month and VR getting to the point where it actually is being able to simulate real experiences. My guess is humans are not well evolved to die and deal with that mentally. Just be maybe hold off the VR Dark Souls for a sec. But yeah.
Well, I think that is that's sort of a side point about VR, is it a cool visual technology? Absolutely. But it's also, it seems to be importing a bunch of controls, like a very standard control scheme. Like,
right.
I don't think, and it doesn't really make sense to have VR with a controller. And so,
well, until we,
for that reason, I think it homogenizes some of your options in terms of gameplay. Like, there is no simplifying the control scheme in a VR environment because you're not holding a controller. Like, a controller is a simplified way of interacting with a game.
With the world. Yeah, I mean, let's take a short little detour and basically until the way we interact with games is physically, right, with our hands, and that's our most manipulative, that's our finest tuned thing that we can do to interact with the world around us in large part is your hands, or at least the easiest and most accessible. I think there could be a argument made for tongue motion would be more precise, but anyway, point is, you don't see too many mouth-based video games, and if someone tries to sell you one, don't. It's a trap. But no, seriously, until we actually find a better way to interface between like humans and technology than just physically pressing something with your hands, I do think VR is good. I mean, basically what I'm talking about is something resembling like direct neurological input.
Right.
Then VR would work great because you could begin actually controlling what you were talking about with your mind, but then we'd start to get into a whole set of problems. But I think you're right, as we are right now, even with motion. I mean, yeah, think about like trying to do like a fighting, like part of the trip of games in general, and particularly fighting games, like we're talking about with Spectacle, was the power dynamic, the fact that you are doing things that you cannot actually do.
Right.
And I'm sure there's all kinds of clever ways people will be able to leverage it, but in terms of the actual interaction, the game itself, it does seem like that needs to be the really next big step. I think VR as like you said, a visual technology, being able to project to the user is probably getting pretty good. But being able to interact with that is, I think, a problem that has not been solved.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Like, think about somebody who's wheelchair bound trying to play a VR fighting game.
Right.
right? Is it like
Yeah, no,
given
exactly.
the current control scheme that doesn't even make sense.
I mean, much less the fact that we are physical creatures, like confined to a physical reality. So if you're going to be fighting games in the living room and you don't have, like 20 square feet of open movement, then
That's true. You have
it's
to
not going to be too much fun.
go to a dojo with your VR headset.
Which at that point you're literally in a freaking dojo, so actually fight so like. So,
Wow, we're gonna kill Greg by the end of this. He's getting riled up.
but moving from the fighting genre into the action adventure genre, like I said, which is platforming plus fighting and combat combined. Think about, again, I'll go back to Dark Souls actually, which is decent because in fighting games you usually don't have any sense of, basically if you're good enough, and everyone who plays fighting games is good enough, you can basically make attacks almost nonstop, right?
Right.
Again, when you get down to the really minuscule like frame data, where you're talking about like a 6 frame down 2 is really good, and the NetherRealm games as a literal tenth of a second of reaction time, so it's really really tight. In single player game, that's the other big thing. Is the fighting games are designed to be played against other, right? That is really core to their design. You don't see any like competitive PvE fighting games.
Right.
Now, most action adventure games are not PvP. They're in fact PvE, and as the character usually will be able to do a similar thing where you can make an unbroken string of attacks. Now, in fighting games, there's also another dynamic that usually limits your ability to do that indefinitely, right? If you just open someone up and then kill them with the correct combo string, that's no fun. So they
Right.
have stuff like increased gravity and reduce hit stun and yada yada yada. Reduced launchers. In action games, you usually don't have that. You can just kind of attack ad nauseum. Think about like Zelda. I talked a lot about God of War. That's one of my favorite series. The Darksider series that I played last week when I was sick. Well, the first game anyway. I mean, the Arkham series to an extent. That's a whole other beast when it comes to combat. But you don't have a limit, right, on how many times you can attack. And to solve that problem, then, because then the gameplay would just become, hey, run up to a creature and just press the attack button until it's dead. If you were getting stunned, if you put the creature into hit stun every single time. And there's some games that kind of do that. Really simplifies combat basically that, right? I forget, you had a few examples, Mark. Or just like early enemies,
Yeah.
and say like,
Yeah, basic enemies like if in Zelda you're fighting a goblin, like if you get the first hit on like some little goblin, it's gonna just be in hit stun until you kill it. Like
right.
in any Zelda game that I've played, basically, and that's kind of what you want for easy enemies, right? You don't want to be having to think about how to counterplay every enemy you come across like it's a person.
Unless you're playing Dark Souls, because that's literally what that game is.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So that's a very
Literally, the
specific
design mechanic was
the and
every enemy can kill you.
the enemy density in Dark Souls, I think, reflects that difficulty. Like,
Oh, absolutely.
if you had the enemy density of a Zelda game and a Dark Souls game, you couldn't also have puzzles. Like, it just would be
Oh,
too
yeah.
much.
Totally. I mean,
But
yeah,
be-
no, I mean, God of War is
but
no possible way you can do anything like that.
in an adventure game, like you're doing things other than just fighting enemies. Like you're
Yes.
trying to either figure out where to go next, you're trying to maybe escort an NPC, you're trying to solve a puzzle, maybe you're trying to collect an item. Like there's lots of other things that are occupying your focus than just, okay, what's my next move against this enemy?
Right.
In Dark Souls, there's trying to figure out where to go, but then it's mostly just combat. And so I think you can get
In
away
large
with
part, it really is.
you can get away with deeper combat, and in a game where there's more going on, I think you've got to scale combat back a bit. And so,
Correct.
a game like Zelda, unless it's a boss fight, the enemies are fairly straightforward. There's a few gimmicks where, like, oh, this character has a shield, so you have to disarm them or things like that. But
And so again, with that, the 2D fighting or just fighting games in general, there had to be an artificial stance put in by the producers of the game to make sure that you couldn't just kill someone in one hit. Similarly, if you're going to make another enemy, basically Dark Souls did that too. They put in a stamina gauge, right? You can't just attack indefinitely in Dark Souls. In fact, every single strike you have or block you take reduces your stamina bar, and when that's empty, you can't do anything. You can basically run away at low speed and die. Which I think is really interesting. Because, like I said, in these kind of adventure games where you don't have anything like that, the enemies are necessarily a lot less deadly and a lot less intense. And if you want a way more basically intense combat experience, you have to have the enemy feel threatening And in order to do that, you have to give the player some limitations as well, similar to how a fighting game is balanced between the two characters. I think that's a brilliant part of Dark Souls, is that mechanic where you do have a limited amount of resources to expend, and it does become less about it's certainly not a button mashing game, but
No.
it's a lot less about getting in and making sure that you kind of just get off this one combo as really learning the enemies, learning timing, and then taking advantage of weaknesses, which I think is why that combat is so deep. It's very it's completely three dimensional, and it's like I said, the hitboxes are really tight, and there's tons of ways to engage nearly every enemy, which I think is quite impressive.
Yeah, they really. So, in order to reduce that problem of stun locking your enemy to death, there's a few different ways that 3D games have gone and tackled that. But most 3D games do. They have some way of preventing you because blocking kind of took a nerf. As we mentioned, like blocking became harder in 3D, and so you kind of have
Right.
to have an alternative to just, oh, my enemies are really good at blocking,
Right.
because it will just start to feel cheap to the player if they're so much better at blocking than the player is. And
Yeah.
so, in order to prevent your NPCs from just staying stun locked the whole time, there are various ways to either prevent the player from attacking constantly, or make it so that even if they do attack, the your enemy is not taken out of whatever they're doing, because
Right.
otherwise they'll never do anything.
Right. And that's like basically in the big 3D combat game. I think Devil May Cry is a decent series, another good example of it. I love these kind of Zelda-esque games. Again, shout out to Ocarina of Time in large part. Again, if we're going to go down the history route, the first game that really did 3D adventure combat was, and figured out literally even how to do that, was basically Ocarina of Time. It's another thing you can lay at that game's feet as basically the granddaddy of all 3D combat games, figuring out how to target things, figuring out how to control the camera, which actually wasn't even great in that case, but figuring out how to move, how to switch between melee and ranged attacks, all that is really pretty much pioneered by Ocarina, and then perfected by games like, I consider God of War to be the pinnacle of 3D action. I think it's the best combat that I've ever played. Certainly in terms of like melee stuff,
Mm-hmm.
outside of fighting games. And then I
One of,
guess, like I said, the Arkham system, right, where you really simplify down to one a button and a counter, and is way more about kind of rhythm than anything else. It's more about rhythm and timing and strategy. Um, Certainly than kind of the really frantic, quick based combat of say God of War or Darksiders. I feel like those are two very kind of separate systems, and honestly, a lot of people have a lot of problems with the Arkham system in terms of it being too simplified. Right, that's a
right.
very common critique of that system. Same thing with like the
Mm,
Shadow of War, Shadow of Mordor series. Basically
mm-hmm.
implements the same system, and you can basically press one button, and then you do this incredible string of moves and decapitate something, and it feels awesome, but it's also actually very, very simple. Kind of press X to win game, sort of
Yeah. Well,
style.
and going back to what you mentioned about Ocarina of Time pioneering things, one of the things it did was introduce a lock-on system, and I would say
Right.
the perfection of a lock-on system is Arkham. The Arkham games have a very fluid locking system where you typically
Yeah, no,
do
that's a good point.
have you that your lock is always switching. Like they made it very fluid feeling, but you do
Yeah.
always have like the enemy you're targeting. And if you
Yep.
think about like 2D games don't do that. I cannot think of a single 2D game where you have a locking system where you're using a melee sort of attack.
Yeah.
Possibly with shooting, you could have like homing rockets and things like that. But if you think about what that does to a three-dimensional combat encounter, it reduces the number of dimensions you're dealing with back down to two, because
Right.
you have one of your rotation is always locked toward facing that enemy. So now you just
Right.
worry about either you just are managing your distance from the
Yep.
enemy, and then you can attack them
And your
like it's
movement.
in a
And your strength.
two-axis combat system.
Precisely. That's it right there. And it's interesting. So again, I'm playing Darksiders a lot. Huge shout outs to those games because I love them. I think they're highly underrated. And there's a thing coming which I'm super excited about because that whole series was published by THQ, which is a developer or a publisher that went bankrupt suddenly, and I thought the series was going to end. They had plans for more, but anyway, we are getting a third one in 2018, which is really cool. I'm very excited. But anyway, Darksiders is a game that does that pretty well in terms of you have a lock-on button, basically. You can either hold it down and be centered on a single character, a single enemy, which, like Mark said, literally reduces it back down to the two-dimensional thing. Or when there's a lot of enemies, that actually doesn't work as well. You actually want to just have free control of your character. So it kind of actually gives you the best of both worlds in that regard. On bosses, it actually is easier to have the camera locked boss when it's just one character. Also, if you're paying attention, back to the 2D, 3D fighting thing, very similar.
Right.
But when you have a lot more enemies and a lot more complexity and a lot more axes, having more control, the true, kind of omnidirectional movement of your character is way and is very fun. It also should be noted that some of the best fighting games are also the most brutal ones. Can't think of, like, God of War is a notoriously brutal series. Darksiders is similar. Zelda's definitely not known for that. But then you got Mortal Kombat. Certainly everyone's favorite part of the Street Fighter and Marvel vs. Capcom series are their super moves, so on and so forth. So cool. Well, that's a great segue then into, you were talking about shooters.
Yeah, so we're going to definitely do shooters next week. If you think about the different topics we've been covering and the things that have had to transition when you change dimensions, one of the big things we haven't talked about yet, the elephant in the room, would be line of sight. So the things you actually can see in a three-dimensional context are very different than the things you can see in a two-dimensional context.
Yeah.
And a little bit of a preview of next week is that
basically it's really good for shooting.
Yeah, it's very important for shooting. It makes shooting a much more complicated thing because actually shooting is inherently a two-dimensional phenomenon. Whereas fighting is, especially when you're using weapons, as Greg mentioned, it's very 3D. And so moving a fighting game from 2D to 3D makes it feel a lot more natural and a bit more interesting, I would say. And it turns out actually too interesting and too complex, which we've already covered.
Yeah, right. Too much.
But with shooting, it actually doesn't get more complicated. It stays 2D because there is a coordinate plane where you can plot a projectile where it is inherently just a two-dimensional arc, not allowing for weird boomeranging effects and interesting other kinetic weapons.
Which we'll get to too.
Yes, we'll get to those. But it's just to give you something to think about. First-person shooters are still really popular, even though it's in modeling an inherently two-dimensional phenomenon. So consider this in the coming
Consider
week.
The following.
Yes.
Consider the incoming.
Consider that. Yeah, we'll talk about it next week. So thank you all for joining us and the re-recording of our fighting episode, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, guys.
If you enjoyed this episode of Gaming Mechanics, check out our Twitter @GamingMechanics or Facebook by going to facebook.com/gamingmechanics. Thanks for listening.